Throughout Formula One's 75-season history, many legendary teams and drivers have had mountains of success to speak of. From the 5 Drivers' Championships of Juan Manuel Fangio during the 1950s to Colin Chapman's Lotus team challenging the mighty Ferrari operation for the title of the most successful outfit in the sport's history, legacies have been forged by those who break boundaries, find loopholes, and reinvent one or several aspects of a competition. One such example of this is the 7-time champion Michael Schumacher. He basically invented serious driver fitness in terms of actively controlling his diet and worked extremely hard to improve his physique and strength to have a long career in racing. Entering Formula One in 1991 at the Belgian Grand Prix, where he proceeded to outperform his experienced teammate Andrea De Cesaris before having an unfortunate failure on race day, he then moved to Benetton despite a contract dispute between Eddie Jordan and Flavio Briatore, but nonetheless he was able to match and at times beat his accomplished counterpart in the other seat, that being the 1981, 83 and 87 champion Nelson Piquet. He picked up his first win at Spa in 1992, then won 2 titles with the Enstone outfit in completely normal and uncontroversial circumstances, before moving to an undisputedly struggling Ferrari team in 1996. He worked wonders in an underperforming car in his first season for the Scuderia, and took Jacques Villeneuve to the final round in Jerez the year after, when that Williams car was far too dominant to expect anything other than a rampant walkaway performance from the Canadian. But after losing out to the flying Finn Mika Hakkinen twice, Schumacher took Ferrari's first driver's crown since Jody Scheckter in 1979, and their first constructors' one since 1983. He then proceeded to dominate F1 with an unprecedented streak of 4 more championships to add to his 2000 triumph, before a mediocre 2005 season due to rule changes was followed by one last hurrah in 06. He took Fernando Alonso right to the wire, however was unable to claim an elusive 8th title, which at the time wouldn't have really been much different from his already existing 7, but with the rise of Lewis Hamilton and him taking a septet of seasons where he won, it seems drivers in motorsports are doomed to never have more than 7 titles. Unless you're Sebastian Loeb, or Augustin Canapino that is. However, it's not Schuey's glory years that this video is about. It's instead concerning his much more quiet stint returning in the 2010s that gave fans one last glimpse at the most successful driver in history at that point. Let me tell you the story of Michael Schumacher's underrated Mercedes return.
Juan Manuel Fangio is in the lead on the last lap of the German Grand Prix.
Jim Clark drives the Formula One Lotus Sport to victory on the racetracks of the world.
And look at that! Colossally, that's Mansell. That is Nigel Mansell. Alain Prost has taken the advantage. Senna is trying to go through on the inside, and it's happened immediately. This is amazing. Senna goes off at the first corner.
And I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat.
The idea of F1 champions returning from retirement is nothing new, with the first proper example being when Niki Lauda returned in 1982 following a 3-year absence from the grid. He came back due to pressure from McLaren sponsors Marlboro wanting a world champion in the team, and after 2 decent seasons, he took a surprise title in 1984, beating future legend Alain Prost in equal machinery. Aside from Lauda, Prost himself made a return after a 1-year sabbatical in 1993 and won his 4th championship with Williams, and Nigel Mansell did the same thing a year later, helping the team recover from the untimely loss of Ayrton Senna. He won the season-ending Australian Grand Prix when Schumacher and Hill collided, then an ill-fated move to McLaren in 1995 ended the Englishman's F1 career. Mika Hakkinen took a sabbatical after the 2001 season, but this eventually turned into retirement, which leads us nicely on to the Michael's departure from F1. He had left Ferrari following a failed title bid in 2006, with rumours abound that there was significant pressure from the higher-ups at the team forcing him out, as they felt the young startlet Kimi Räikkönen was a better driver, with Schumi essentially jumping before he was pushed. He remained an advisor to the team for a short period, and tested electronic components and tyres for the 2008 season as well. He dabbled in amateur motorbike racing too, but when the Scuderia suffered a driver dilemma following Felipe Massa's injury in qualifying for the Hungarian Grand Prix in 2009, a 40-year-old Schumacher offered to step in and drive until the Brazilian vice-champion was fit again. He tested the team's 2007 car, and Ferrari attempted to get an exemption from the FIA for him to acclimatise to the current spec machinery, but then Michael had to call off any F1 return as a bike accident earlier in the year had damaged his neck and it had not yet healed. It seemed that the out-of-the-blue chance to make his comeback with the major manufacturer had given Schumacher his spark back, as although he was unable to prove himself in 2009, during the December of that year he announced that he would be rejoining the sport full-time in 2010. The incumbent Drivers' and Constructors' Champions Brawn GP were being taken over by Mercedes, who were themselves making a return to Formula One for the first time since 1955, when they pulled out following the Le Mans disaster that took the lives of 83 spectators and one of their drivers. Reactions were mixed to the return of two big names in the world of motorsport, with some believing it will be like the days of old, with Michael in a championship contending car, fighting with the likes of Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel for the first time, and duelling once more with Fernando Alonso and co. However, others were more reserved, as not only had the Michael not driven competitively in a car in over 3 years at the ripe old age of 41, but the idea that the 2009 champions would still be competitive a year later doesn't put into context exactly how they won their crown. They'd started the year as a dominant force, with Jenson Button taking 6 wins from the opening 7 events. But after that, and particularly following the summer break, due to a lack of development, the car was at best 3rd or 4th fastest, well behind new pace-setters Red Bull. With Ferrari and McLaren back on form for 2010, even with manufacturer backing, it was unlikely that Mercedes' impact would be instantly felt on the frontrunners. With the team and Schumacher's prelude to the new season being discussed, we still haven't mentioned his new teammate. Nico Rosberg had established a reputation as a solid midfield driver in the 4 seasons he'd been at Williams, comparing well against Mark Webber in his rookie season and Alex Wurz in 2007, before having the measure of the inconsistent but decent overall Kazuki Nakajima, son of Satoru, who raced during the 1980s and 90s, and more importantly, brought Toyota engines. Rosberg had taken his first podium at Australia in 2008, then took another in the ill-fated Singapore race later that year, and was definitely a good benchmark to measure a returning Schumacher against in 2010. At the first race of the year in Sakhir for the Bahrain Grand Prix on the endurance layout of the circuit, Michael qualified 7th, only 2 places and 3/10 of a second behind Nico. Then during the race, which was mostly uneventful, finished in 6th, only 4 seconds behind his teammate, who was 5th. It wasn't an overly spectacular second debut, but Schumacher hadn't embarrassed himself, didn't make any significant errors, and wasn't hideously far off of Rosberg at any point in the weekend, finishing quite close behind at race's end. The second round of the year was in Melbourne, and Michael qualified 7th, just 1/10 behind Nico, who was 6th. However, at the start, a collision between Jenson Button and Fernando Alonso saw the 7-time champion hit the Spaniard, lose his front wing and drop to 22nd place. Luckily for him though, a crash later round the lap involving the Sauber of Kamui Kobayashi, Sebastian Buemi's Toro Rosso and Nico Hülkenberg's Williams brought out the safety car, allowing the field to bunch back up and he could change his wing with no penalty. He had a battle with Lucas Di Grassi on the first green flag lap on the restart, eventually passing the Virgin, and then recovering to finish 10th out of 14 finishes in what was a very chaotic race that he couldn't really capitalise on. He qualified 8th in Sepang, while Rosberg was 2nd, then made up 2 positions on the opening lap, but unfortunately suffered from a loose wheel nut, which caused him to retire on lap 9 while he watched his teammate take Mercedes' first podium of its own F1 return. Schumacher was 9th in qualifying for the Chinese Grand Prix, and in a dry-to-wet race littered with safety cars, he battled with Lewis Hamilton for 5th place, defending his position twice before the Brit eventually passed him on lap 17, then had a similar fight with Felipe Massa towards the end of the race for 9th, eventually losing out and taking the final points position with 10th, while Rosberg took yet another 3rd place. Schumacher's younger teammate now had 50 points to his 10 and was 2nd in the driver's standings, as since the opening round in Bahrain, Michael had finished no higher than 10th. However, at the next race in Spain, he outqualified Rosberg, and while Nico was involved in an accident at the start, having to take evasive action at turn 1 to avoid a collision with Kamui Kobayashi and Renault's Robert Kubica, as well as tangling with Hülkenberg's Williams later, eventually finishing 13th and lapped, Schumacher took 4th place and 12 points, his best finish of his return so far. Then in the Monaco race, he beat Nico in quali again, and ran 7th ahead of him when a late race safety car was brought out, and the event finished behind it. However, due to a loophole around the green and yellow flag rules and the positioning of the safety car lines, it was technically legal to overtake under these conditions, and so Schumi, being the clever racer he was, who knew the rulebook inside out, he passed Alonso at the final corner to take 6th. However, the stewards gave him a 20-second time penalty because he overtook under safety car conditions. Despite Mercedes' rule protestations, the ruling stood, and he was classified 12th, losing out on 8 points. He redeemed himself in Istanbul by taking 4th again, but finished outside the points in both Canada and Valencia in 11th and 15th. 9th in Silverstone and his home race in Hockenheim were followed by 11th in Hungary, where he had a scuffle with ex-teammate Rubens Barrichello as he pushed him towards the inside wall on the pit straight. Then he was 7th in an intermittently wet race in Spa. He was 9th in Monza, then had an incident with Kobayashi in Singapore which relegated him to 13th. Schumacher had a very good run in the flyaway races, getting 6th in Suzuka, 4th in the inaugural Korean Grand Prix, and 7th in Brazil. Then at the final race of 2010 in Abu Dhabi, he retired following a lap 1 collision with Vitantonio Liuzzi, which in the days before the halo nearly took the German's head off, although he was joking with Liuzzi after the incident, so he clearly didn't think it was that serious. Throughout the year, Michael scored 72 points to his teammates' 142, and Nico had 3 podiums when Schuey had none. He failed to score in races he didn't retire from twice as often as Rosberg, and only beat him in races that both of them finished 5 times. However, he had suffered from bad luck and missed out on good points several times, such as in Melbourne and Monaco, so there was definitely a level of optimism that could be had that he'd improve going into 2011. The main rule change going into the year was the switch from Bridgestone tyres to Pirelli ones, which were designed to wear quickly and had a cheese-like composition. The opening weekend in Melbourne was a struggle as Schumacher missed out on Q3 by 1/10 of a second, then got caught up in a collision with the Toro Rosso of Jaime El Jaswari on the opening lap, which eventually led to his retirement on lap 19 due to collision damage. Rosberg also retired after a collision with Williams' Rubens Barrichello, which meant Mercedes hadn't had the best start to the season. Nonetheless, Michael scored their first points of the year in Sepang with 9th, while Nico was 11th, but struggled in China, missing out on Q3 yet again, and despite recovering to 8th, Rosberg was 18 seconds ahead in 5th place. He drove to a mediocre 12th in Turkey, then was 6th in Spain, where he'd got his joint best result in the season before, ahead of Nico. A retirement due to a fire in Monaco was followed by a wet-to-dry race in Montreal. Schumacher showed why he had the nickname Rainmeister during his glory years by sitting in 2nd place for a large portion of the race, although he eventually fell to 4th in the closing laps as the track dried out, still half a minute clear of Rosberg, who was outside the points in 11th. It was an unlucky race in Valencia as he collided with Vitaly Petrov in the pit lane during one of his stops, had to do a lap without a front wing and then come back in again to replace it, after which he found overtaking difficult on the twisty track. He was 9th in Silverstone, 18 seconds behind Rosberg who was 6th, then finished 1 position behind him in Hockenheim in 8th. A gearbox failure in Hungary was followed by a race in Spa, where after a wheel failure caused Schumacher to crash in Q1 and start 24th and last, the lowest position of his entire career, he climbed up 9 positions on the opening lap alone, and following a nicely timed safety car when Lewis Hamilton moved over on Kamui Kobayashi in the braking zone at Les Combes on lap 13, he was 6th, before he passed Rosberg on the approach to Les Combes later on and finished 5th, in arguably his best drive since his return at the start of the year prior so far. He took another 5th place in Monza while Rosberg retired. Then at Singapore, he was closing in on his teammate and rookie Sergio Perez, but accidentally ran into the back of the Mexican at turn 7, putting him out of the race. Then at Suzuka, he ran a long stint on the prime tyres before switching to options towards the end. As many others pitted before him, it meant that he led the race from laps 38 to 40 before making his pit stop and finishing 6th, 17 seconds clear of Nico who was 10th. He'd led laps in an F1 race for the first time since 2006. Then he retired in the Korean Grand Prix after a crash with Vitaly Petrov. He finished a solid 5th at the first F1 race held in India, again ahead of Rosberg. Then 7th place in Abu Dhabi, came before a lowly 15th at the final round in Interlagos, although this was because he suffered a puncture after a collision with Bruno Senna at the final corner, after which the Brazilian got a drive-through penalty. Schumacher's second season of his comeback went better than his first, scoring 76 points to Rosberg's 89, and only losing 7-6 in races where both drivers finished. Michael got the team's best finish with 4th in Canada, and one more 5th place than Nico, although he scored points only 11 times to his teammates' 14. He definitely was improving despite his ever-increasing age, and would be a remarkable 43 going into 2012, the oldest an F1 driver had been since Graham Hill in 1975, and was definitely performing better than Hill was at that age. I've done a video on Graham's career, by the way, if you'd like to check it out in the top right corner of your screen. Despite mostly inconsistent qualifying form in the previous 2 years, Michael put his car 4th on the grid at the season opener in Melbourne while Nico was 7th. He moved into the provisional podium positions in the early stages, however unfortunately suffered gearbox failure on lap 10, while Rosberg finished 12th after a collision with Sergio Perez on the final lap while fighting for 7th. In qualifying for the Malaysian Grand Prix, Schumacher got 3rd, his highest grid position since 2006, and therefore the best of his return so far. Then at the start, approaching turn 4 in wet conditions, he and the Lotus of Romain Grosjean collided, causing both drivers to spin and fall towards the back. The safety car was brought out due to the incessant rain on lap 7, followed by a red flag on lap 9. He was running 15th when the stoppage came, and as it dried up in the second phase, he recovered to 10th, taking Mercedes' first points of the year ahead of Rosberg again, who was 13th. However, had he not got caught up with Grosjean, he could have had a much better result. It was a 1-2 start for the team in China, with Nico in front thanks to the team's innovative front-wing F-duct design that was alternatively known as double DRS, being very effective on the long back straight in Shanghai. Michael had actually qualified third behind Lewis Hamilton's McLaren, but the Brit had taken a 5-place grid penalty for a gearbox change, which promoted Schumacher to second. He was running second behind his teammates until he came into the pits on lap 12, where he accidentally left his pit box before his front right wheel had been fitted, forcing him to retire, and commentator Martin Brundle uttered potentially the greatest line in F1 commentary history.
No, I haven't been this disappointed as in Shrek 2. That is such a shame.
Nico went on to win, and Michael was left ruining what could have been, again. Then in Bahrain struggled to 18th in qualifying before getting back up to 10th, 16 seconds behind his teammates. Then on lap 12 in Spain, after Bruno Senna collided with Romain Grosjean and damaged the Lotus driver's car, Schumacher caught him quickly and was running right behind him when the pair collided going into turn 1, putting both of them out of the race. Michael said Bruno moved under braking, but the Williams driver said he expected the Mercedes to try and overtake on the inside. Michael was deemed at fault for the crash by the stewards and was given a 5-place grid penalty for the next race in Monaco. It was maybe an ironic twist then when he qualified on pole position in the Principality, but was demoted to 6th place due to his penalty. Then at the start, he was involved in a collision with Grosjean for the second time that season, but despite this, ran in 7th place until a fuel pressure problem forced him to retire on lap 63. Had he started on pole, there's a good chance he could have avoided the collision with Grosjean and led the race, potentially avoiding damage that might have led to his eventual retirement from the race. So, to summarise his season so far, he'd had gearbox failure and a spin in Australia and Malaysia respectively, where he could have been on for a podium in each, a wheel failure in Shanghai when he had a chance at winning, crashed in Spain when he was on for a top 5, which then screwed his chances at a win in Monaco. Had all of those races gone his way, he would have been leading the championship on 90 points, 14 ahead of Alonso, but he was instead on a paltry 2. A mediocre race in Canada saw him reach a high of 8th place, but retired with hydraulics failure while running 12th. Then at the European Grand Prix, he finally got some luck, as both Sebastian Vettel and Romain Grosjean retired from race-winning positions. Then Lewis Hamilton and Pastor Maldonado collided while fighting for 3rd place in the closing laps, meaning Schumacher picked up the pieces to claim his first podium in 6 years, and became the oldest podium finisher since Jack Brabham in 1970, and the second oldest in history that didn't achieve one during the 1950s. He then took 7th place in Silverstone and Hockenheim, getting fastest lap in the latter. At the Hungarian Grand Prix, he accidentally stopped in the 19th grid slot instead of the 17th one. Then when the start was aborted, he instead thought it was being delayed, and so he switched his car off to avoid overheating. However, as the second formation lap got underway, he had to be pushed back into the pits to get his engine restarted, and thus he began the race from the pit lane. Then to continue the comedy of errors, it turned out that he'd forgotten to turn on the pit lane speed limiter, and thus accidentally sped, incurring a drive-through penalty before the race had even started. Recovering from the back, he was running 18th when technical problems forced him to retire. He was 7th in Spa, then 6th in Monza, before he crashed into Jean-Eric Vergne in Singapore in eerily similar circumstances to the year prior, running into the back of another car at the same corner as before. After this accident, partly due to concerns over Michael's age and his dithering on signing a new contract, Mercedes signed Lewis Hamilton for 2013 to replace the 7-time champion, and Schumacher promptly announced his retirement that would come at season's end in the days leading up to the Japanese Grand Prix. He had a 10-place grid penalty from the collision with Vergne the race before and started 23rd, but made a rapid start just like Spa the previous year, moving up to 14th as several cars had incidents. Despite this, he struggled to make up any more ground and finished 11th. He took another lowly 13th position in Korea, then retired from a subpar Indian Grand Prix weekend after he ran near the back all day due to getting an early puncture. He was 11th in Abu Dhabi, then qualified 5th in Kota before plummeting down the field in the race, eventually finishing 16th. At the season-ending Brazilian Grand Prix, he went out with one last hurrah in a chaotic changeable conditions race that he relished, finishing 7th after symbolically waving through his younger German counterpart Sebastian Vettel, who was on his way to his 3rd title. Schumacher was 13th in the year's standings, scoring 49 points, while teammate Rosberg got 93. However, he could have easily doubled his tally if it wasn't for circumstances shafting his luck in the first half of the year. He matched his teammate's average qualifying position and drew 10-10 overall in the Saturday battles. Discounting races where one driver retired and the other didn't, Michael beat Nico 7-2, although that does nullify 11 races due to the fact that the Mercedes had bad reliability. Schumi also retired from 8 races to Rosberg's 3, although 2 of those could be attributed to his own fault. Nonetheless, 2012 was definitely Michael's best season, as he could have been an early title contender before the performance of his car fell off towards the end of the year, and despite being in podium contention 5 times, only got 1, and that came arguably in his worst individual performance of the lot. 2010 and 11 were a mixed bag, as he clearly had good speed in changeable conditions, but lacked the consistency to threaten Nico in 2010. He matched him in 2011 and beat him in 2012, which begs the question, if he'd stayed in F1 and re-signed with Mercedes for at least a year or two more, could he have won races, or even an 8th title at his ripe old age? Obviously we'll never know, but given his trajectory against Rosberg, plus his experience in battling for championships, he would have been poised to potentially win 2014 even at the age of 45. There is an alternate F1 history where Michael signs a new contract, wins an 8th crown with Mercedes, and Lewis doesn't win another until 2017 or 18, when the German team finally loosened its stranglehold on the sport. I hate it when people say Schumacher embarrassed himself by coming back, but considering before his comeback he was over 40 years old, had been out of any serious racing for over 3 years, and came back to a brand new tyre and car concept, I think he did better than we should have expected. If you look at other champions who took similarly long breaks, Niki Lauda was 33 when he came back, so he would have felt the effects of returning a lot less hard on his body, and Fernando Alonso was racing in both Le Mans and IndyCar to keep himself fresh for a potential F1 return. Schumacher also helped develop the Mercedes team and the new hybrid engines that helped them dominate for so long after he retired, but he hardly ever receives credit for it. Another more somber note is that if he stayed in F1 longer, he'd have probably not had his skiing accident and would have been able to watch Hamilton and Rosberg win titles for his team and probably smirk while Vettel and Leclerc tried to replicate his success with Ferrari. It's unfortunate how circumstances have gone for him, but hopefully he'll at least be able to acknowledge what's happened in recent years, particularly with his son Mick, so keep fighting, Michael. Anyways, with that being said, I think that brings today's video to a close. I hope you enjoyed me documenting Michael Schumacher's Mercedes return in 2010, and if you did, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to see more content from me in the future. You can also subscribe to my Patreon if you'd like to get access to videos early for as little as $1 per month, and also follow my Instagram where I post behind the scenes stuff and video updates. Big shout out to my Patreon subscribers Andy Lamberts and Eamon Al Dowdy, but without further ado, I'm Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!